The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main conference room. I remember thinking it was odd, a meeting, with just me and the head of HR, Sarah Jenkins. No agenda was attached. I walked in, and the room was too cold, the air conditioning humming loudly. Sarah was already there, sitting at the far end of the long table, a thin folder in front of her. She didn't smile, she just gestured for me to sit. She started with the corporate preamble, how the company was always looking for ways to innovate, to streamline, to stay ahead of the curve. She used words like synergy and paradigm shift. Then she got to the point. My role, specifically my role as a senior client relations strategist, was being made redundant, not eliminated. She was quick to clarify, but automated. They were implementing a new artificial intelligence system. She explained it was a state-of-the-art platform capable of handling all one Peterson Global had ever launched. It was the founder's pet project. It had huge sentimental value and was kept alive for prestige, not for profit. The AI's report, delivered in a cold, bullet-pointed PDF, was seen as incredibly insulting. The client contact was furious. He called the main switchboard, demanding to speak to a human being, and the AI, following its protocol, tried to route him to a FAQ page. That was the spark. That's what I got. Their solution was swift. They called it a restructuring opportunity. They said that my role was too critical to leave vacant, even for a few weeks, so they weren't going to grant a leave. Instead, they hired a permanent replacement. They framed it as a chance for me to take a step back, a forced sabbatical. But it felt exactly like what it was, an exile, a betrayal. I was told to train my replacement, this bright-eyed new graduate, on all my clients, all my processes. The irony was so thick you could taste it, handing over a decade of institutional knowledge to someone who was walking into the same trap I had. The isolation was immediate. My access was revoked. My name disappeared from the project lists. I was on forced leave. But it wasn't a vacation. It was a purgatory. I'd see emails from former colleagues pop up about meetings I wasn't invited to, about decisions being made without me. I felt like a ghost. For the first few weeks, I tried to enjoy the silence, but the guilt and the anger were always there, just under the surface. I'd hear snippets from old coworkers. The new hire, Sarah, was struggling badly. The workload that had taken me years to build a tolerance for hit her like a freight train. She was working late, missing deadlines, making mistakes I never would have made, because I knew the clients, I knew the history. The clients noticed, of course they noticed. I started getting texts from a few of my key accounts. What's going on over there? One of them wrote, we haven't had a coherent report in a month. Another one called me directly. We keep getting passed around to different people. No one seems to know what's happening. Is everything okay? The drop in quality was becoming a real problem. The constant turnover of points of contact was eroding their trust. Then came the call from the biggest client, the one that represented nearly 20% of our division's revenue. It was the CEO himself. He didn't mince words. He said the service had become unacceptable. He said his team was frustrated. And then he asked the question point blank, we need stability. We need someone who knows our business. Are you coming back? I didn't know what to say. I told him I was on leave, and that I wasn't sure what the future held. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, well, you let me know. Our next contract is up for review in a quarter, and frankly, this instability is a major concern for us. The message was clear. The clients weren't just complaining. They were ready to walk. The company's decision to replace me was about to cost them their most important accounts. About 2 months into my forced leave, I got a call from the department head, the same one who had told me I wasn't Alan. His tone was completely different. It was conciliatory, almost nervous. He asked if I would come in for a meeting. He said it was important. When I walked into the office, it felt strange, like visiting a house you used to live in. He and my manager were both there. They started with small talk, but it was awkward. Then they got to the point. They admitted it. They said the role as it was structured was too demanding. They said Sarah had resigned. Shed lasted less than 3 months. They said the clients were unhappy. They said, and I'll never forget the phrasing, the situation has become untenable. They asked me to come back full-time with a title bump and a small raise. I looked at them across the table. I felt a strange sense of calm. I'd had 2 months to think about this, to think about what I wanted, what I needed. I told them no. I said I wouldn't come back to the same unsustainable grind. I saw the panic in their eyes. They started backpedaling. They asked what it would take. This was my moment. I laid out my terms. I would return, but not as a full-time employee. I would come back as a senior consultant on a 3-day-a-week contract. My hourly rate would be triple my The denial from upper management was strong at first. They insisted the AI's recommendation was technically sound. They blamed the client for being emotionally attached to outdated practices. They even suggested it was a form of resistance to change. But then another major client, Sterling Solutions, had a similar issue. The AI had failed to grasp the subtle, unspoken tension between two key executives on their side, and its communication style ended up inflaming the situation. The cracks were no longer previous salary. I would have complete autonomy over my schedule, no mandatory meetings. Unless absolutely critical, I would handle the key clients. But I would not be taking on any new ones, and most importantly, I would not be checking email after hours. My time was my own. They balked at the numbers. They said it was unprecedented. I told them the client attrition they were facing was also unprecedented. I was calm. I had nothing to lose. I was already gone. They asked for a day to consider it. The next morning, they called. They agreed to every single term. They had no choice. The stability of their biggest accounts depended on it. When I returned it was on my own terms. The difference was night and day. I worked my 3 days. I did my job well. But at 5 o'clock, I logged off completely. The world didn't end. The clients were happy because they had consistency and quality again. The company had to hire 2 junior people to handle the workload I was covering, which actually created a better structure. My return set a new precedent. Other employees saw that it was possible to push back. The conversation in the office started to shift towards sustainable workloads and employee well-being. But it wasn't driven by a sudden burst of managerial empathy. It was driven by client demand. The clients wanted the stability that came from a healthy, supported employee. They had begged me to come back because they needed the quality work I produced, and the only way to get that was to allow me to have a life. The price of burnout was higher than they ever imagined. They learned that replacing a burned-out employee was far more expensive than simply supporting one. And I learned that my worth wasn't defined by my capacity to endure pain. It was defined by the quality of my work. And that quality was directly linked to my well-being. The break they forced on me was the best thing that ever happened. It gave me the leverage to rebuild my life on my own terms. The first sign was the new intern, Sarah. She wasn't just any intern. Her last name was the same as the CEO's. You'd see her in meetings, sitting quietly in the corner. But you'd also see the way the department heads would seek her out afterward, asking for her thoughts on things she had no business having thoughts on. It was subtle at first, then it wasn't. The favoritism started to bleed into everything. I'd lead a project. My team would put in 80-hour weeks to land a major account. And at the presentation to the executive, Sarah would be sitting right next to the VP. He'd say things like, "Sarah's been instrumental in shaping the strategy here. She'd been instrumental in fetching coffee." But she'd smile, this vague, entitled little smile, and the VP would nod like she'd just discovered gravity. The sidelining was a slow, deliberate process. My responsibilities started to get reassigned. "We think Sarah could really benefit from taking the lead on the Johnson account." My manager would say the Johnson account was my biggest success. I'd built that relationship from the ground up over 5 years. But it was framed as a development opportunity for her. My achievements were being used as stepping stones for someone who hadn't earned a single one. The inevitable announcement came in a bland all-staff email. A new role was being created: Director of Strategic Client Relations. Sarah, with her 18 months of experience, was the appointee. The email praised her fresh perspective and dynamic approach. My role, Senior Account Manager, was being absorbed into this new structure. I was being made redundant, not because my work was poor, but because a space needed to be cleared. The office politics weren't just a game anymore, they were a demolition crew. And my career was the building being torn down to make room for a monument to nepotism. The reign of incompetence began the moment Sarah's nameplate went up on the door. It was like watching someone try to fly a jumbo jet after only ever reading a picture book about airplanes. The fundamental skills just weren't there. She didn't understand our billing software. She couldn't draft a coherent project timeline. Basic industry terminology was a complete mystery to her. Cracks, they were becoming chasms. The clients noticed first. I'd get calls not to my direct line, but to my personal cell phone. "Hey," they'd say, their voices tight with confusion. "I just got off the phone with Sarah, the new director. She asked me to explain the difference between a gross and net media buy." I thought that was, her job. They weren't angry, yet they were baffled. They were having to explain the very concepts they were paying us to understand. Then the delays started. Projects we'd run like clockwork for years, began to stutter and stall. Simple approvals would take weeks instead of days. Because Sarah would sit on the paperwork unsure of how to process it or too afraid to ask for help and expose her ignorance. The frustration from the clients shifted from bafflement to outright irritation. "I need someone who can actually get this done," one of my old contacts said to me, his tone weary. "I am spending more time managing your director than I am managing my own campaign." The public mistakes were the most damaging. There was the quarterly review with our largest client, Ethelred Pharmaceuticals. It was a huge meeting, their entire marketing team flown in. Sarah was leading the presentation. Halfway through, she mispronounced the name of their flagship product. Not just a slight stumble, a complete butchering of it. There was an audible intake of breath in the room. Then she presented data from a campaign that wasn't theirs. Shed mixed up the decks. The Ethelred VP just stared at her, his face a mask of cold disbelief. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, collected his team, and walked out. The reputation we'd spent a decade building for meticulous, reliable service was crumbling in a matter of months. The clientele investigation happened quietly behind the scenes. I didn't know about it until it was over. The key players, Ethelred and a few other major accounts, had grown so frustrated that they started talking to each other. They compared notes on the bizarre requests, the constant delays, the elementary errors. They weren't just complaining, they were conducting due diligence. They needed to understand why the quality of service had fallen off. One of the client CEOs knew a member of our board of directors. Socially, it wasn't an accusatory call, more of a concerned inquiry. "We're seeing some worrying trends," he said. "We're trying to understand the strategic shift happening over there." That opened the door. The clients did what our own internal HR should have done. They looked into Sarah's qualifications, her rapid promotion. They connected the dots that everyone in the office saw but were too afraid to voice. The formal letter arrived on the CEO's desk. It was from the board of the Ethelred account, but it was cosigned by 3 other major clients. It was a masterpiece of corporate politeness that barely concealed the fury beneath. It expressed a profound and growing loss of confidence in the company's leadership. It cited the unexplained and disruptive personnel changes that had led to a precipitous decline in service quality. The letter didn't mention me by name, but it strongly implied that the previous management structure had been effective, and that the new one was not. The threat was clear, though unstated: restore professional standards, or we will take our business elsewhere. The rumor was that they were prepared to stage a coordinated mass exodus, a move that would have crippled the company. The triumph of merit came swiftly after that. The board of directors, who had previously been insulated by the CEO's sunny reports, was now facing a shareholder revolt. Led by our most important customers, they intervened with brutal efficiency. An emergency meeting was called. The CEO and the VP, who had championed Sarah, were forced to explain themselves. They couldn't. The pivotal moment came in the form of a joint letter. I still have a copy. It was signed by the heads of Peterson Global, Sterling Solutions, and 3 other major accounts. It wasn't an angry rant, it was worse. It was a cold, professional, and devastatingly clear ultimatum. The letter stated that the impersonal and often misguided communication from the AI was damaging their projects, and more importantly, eroding the trust they had in our company. They formally requested a return to human-managed. The board demanded a full-scale restructuring of the client relations department. Their mandate was simple: reinstate a culture of meritocracy. Promotions and leadership roles were to be based on demonstrable achievement, not family connections. My phone rang. It was the head of the board's compensation committee. She offered me my job back. But it wasn't just my old job, it was a new role: vice president of client services, with a seat on the leadership team. The return was framed as a necessary correction, a move to stabilize the company and rebuild client trust. Sarah was reassigned to a role more commensurate with her current skill set, which was a polite way of saying she was moved back to an assistant-level position, far away from any clients. The cultural shift was the most profound part. The clients, by refusing to accept inferior service, had become the guardians of the company's integrity. They had championed meritocracy more effectively than any internal policy ever could. Meetings now had a different tone. Decisions were questioned not based on who proposed them, but on the quality of the idea itself. People were promoted because they earned it. The atmosphere of whispered resentment was replaced by one of focused, quiet competence. The outsiders Advantage, it turned out, wasn't about being outside at all. It was about the fundamental, unshakable truth that quality work speaks for itself. And sometimes it speaks so loudly that even the most insulated boardrooms are forced to listen. My entire career, my entire professional existence was built around one name, Ethelgard Incorporated. They weren't just our biggest client, they were a universe, unto themselves, a labyrinth of legacy systems, interwoven corporate politics, and a culture so specific you needed a decoder ring just to understand their holiday party invitations. And I was the sole keeper of that ring. My official title was something bland like Senior Client Relations Manager. But that was a lie. I was the Ethelgard Whisperer. For 8 years, I didn't just manage their account, I lived it. I knew that their CFO, Mr. Henderson, would only take a call between 2:15 and 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and only if you opened with a comment about his prized rose bushes. I knew that their internal procurement system, a relic from the 90s they called the beast, would crash if you input an invoice amount with a comma instead of a decimal point. I knew that their flagship product, the Ethelgard 7000, had secret undocumented calibration sequence that their own junior engineers had to call me to remember. I didn't just know their business, I knew their rhythm, their pulse. I could tell when they were stressed by the tone of an email from a middle-level manager. I had memorized the birthdays of their executive assistants. This wasn't a job, it was a symbiosis. And to everyone else in our company, I was an eccentric, a luxury. The sales team saw me as a cost center, a fixed expense that didn't directly bring in new revenue. The general customer service pool thought I was spoiled with my dedicated phone line and my private budget for relationship building, which was code for knowing that the Ethelgard team preferred obscure craft beers over expensive wine at company-wide meetings. I'd get polite, dismissive smiles. They saw my deep, narrow expertise. Limitation, what happens if we lose Ethelgard? They'd whisper. What would she do then? Her skills aren't exactly transferable. They thought I had painted myself into a corner. I thought I had built a fortress. Client relations, they specifically mentioned my name. The letter concluded by stating that if this change was not made, they would be forced to take their business elsewhere at the end of the quarter. The collective revenue represented by those clients was over 60% of our division's income. Then came the new CEO, David Sterling. He arrived with a mandate for agile integration and cross-functional synergy. He saw my role, and others like it, in the company as antiquated. He called it siloed inefficiency. In his first major presentation, he used a chart with a circle labeled Deep Specialists and a big red arrow pointing to a box labeled Generalized Pools. He talked about leveraging a broader knowledge base and creating resilience. He never said my name, but he was looking right at me when he talked about eliminating redundant, non-scalable resources. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was projected onto a screen in 40-point font. The meeting with HR was brutally efficient. My manager, a man who had always been vaguely intimidated by my closeness with the client, couldn't even make eye contact. The HR representative used phrases like strategic pivot and skill set misalignment. She said my deep knowledge of Ethelgard, the very thing that made me indispensable, was now considered a liability. The consensus is that your expertise is too niche. She said, her voice perfectly calm. It doesn't allow for the flexibility the new corporate strategy requires. We appreciate your years of service, but the role is being integrated into the general client services team. I was given a severance package and asked to create a transition document, a 100-page manual on how to handle Ethelgard. I spent my last 2 weeks trying to condense 8 years of instinct of subtle nuance into a bullet-pointed list. It felt like trying to explain a symphony by describing the sheet music. I wrote down the facts: call Henderson on Tuesdays at 2:15 p.m. But I couldn't capture the why, the unspoken tension in his voice. If his roses had aphids' attention, that meant you shouldn't bring up budget overruns. That day I handed over the document, cleared my desk, and left. I remember walking out on that final Friday, the silence of my phone feeling louder than any ring. I was a master of one, and now I was a master of none. The implosion didn't happen on Monday. It took a full 3 days for the cracks to become chasms. That's when I got the first text from a former colleague, Sarah, in IT. They were asking about the Ethelgard 7000 calibration sequence. The one you always handled. The manual you wrote says to refer to their technical docs, but their docs don't mention it. I didn't reply. On Friday my personal phone rang. It was Mark, the head of Ethelgard's operations. a man I considered a friend. His voice was tight. Controlled. What's going on over there? He asked. I've been on hold for 40 minutes. The person who finally picked up had no idea who I was. They tried to transfer me to a general voicemail box. The following Monday was the real meltdown. Ethelgard was attempting their quarterly bulk order, a process that involved the beast and a specific handshake between our systems that I had personally brokered years ago. The new generalized team, following my manual to the letter, input the data. The system rejected it. They tried again. It locked their entire account for 24 hours due to suspicious activity. Ethelgard's production line, a just-in-time operation, was about to grind to a halt because they couldn't get the components we supplied. The internal panic was immediate and total. The stock price dipped on the rumor. Emergency board meetings were called. The same executives who had championed the AI initiative were now scrambling to contain the fallout. I heard all this from Mark, who said the office was in a state of sheer chaos. That's when my phone rang. It was my former direct manager, David. He sounded strained. He asked how I was doing, made some small talk, and then he got to the point. He said the company was facing an unexpected challenge. That's when the floodgates opened. My phone started buzzing incessantly. Texts, calls, emails from panicked former coworkers. The client's CEO is on the line with David Sterling. They're threatening to freeze all payments. They're talking about breach of contract. The generalized pool was drowning. They had broad knowledge about our products, but they had no depth on Ethelgard's unique ecosystem. They didn't know that freezing the account would trigger an automatic alert to Ethelgard's head of security, a paranoid man who would assume it was a cyber attack. They didn't know that the production line delay would cost Ethelgard millions, not just in lost revenue, but in penalties to their clients. The call I never expected came at 9 p.m. that night. It was David Sterling himself. The confident, synergetic CEO was gone. His voice was ragged, stripped of all its corporate polish. We need you to come back. He said the words sounding like they were being physically dragged out of him. Tomorrow, this morning. Rather, it's a disaster. I walked back into the office at 7 a.m. The silence was different this time. It was a tense, anxious, quiet. People didn't just look at me. They stared, as if I were a firefighter arriving at a 5-alarm blaze. David Sterling was waiting for me in the lobby, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He didn't offer pleasantries. Ethelgard's CEO, Julia Reyes, is on a conference call in the boardroom. She's refusing to speak to anyone but you. I picked up the phone. In the boardroom. Julia, it's me. Her relief was palpable, a physical force. Through the line. Thank God. Tell me you can fix this. I can fix this, I said, and I knew I could. I spent the next 4 hours on the phone, not just with Julia, but with their IT, their operations, their security. I talked to people by name. I referenced old agreements. I calmed the paranoid security head by recalling his daughter's graduation. I walked them through the secret calibration sequence over the phone. I unfroze the account by using a backdoor password I'd created and never written down. By lunchtime, the order was processing. The production line was saved. The meeting that afternoon was short. David Sterling, the CFO, and the head of HR were there. Sterling did the talking. We made a catastrophic error in judgment, he began. We fundamentally misunderstood the nature of your contribution. He didn't just offer me my old job back. He offered me a new title, Vice President of Strategic Client Relations, a significant pay raise, and an ironclad 3-year contract that stipulated my role was permanent and protected from any future restructuring. But the real victory wasn't in the title or the money. It was in the lesson etched into the face of every executive in that room. They finally understood that specialized deep domain knowledge isn't a liability, it's a strategic asset of the highest order. It's the difference between a general practitioner and a neurosurgeon. Both are doctors, but you don't send a GP to perform a delicate brain operation. My value wasn't just in what I knew about Ethelgard, it was in the time and trust. I had built a currency that couldn't be integrated into a generalized pool. They had seen in the span of a week how the removal of a single with the new system, he said, my unique skill set was suddenly acutely needed. He asked, and I remember his voice had a pleading tone to it, if I would consider coming back on a temporary consulting basis to help stabilize the situation. Specialized cog could bring the entire machine to a screeching $1 million halt. My niche wasn't a corner I had painted myself into. It was the foundation upon which our most important relationship was built, and they had just tried to remove the foundation without realizing the whole house would collapse. My entire career was built on a single simple belief: the client's success is our success. It wasn't just a slogan on a poster in the lobby, it was the principle I lived by, the compass I used for every single decision. If a client was thriving, then we were thriving. It was that straightforward. But that belief, it put me on a collision course with the rest of the company, especially the sales team and upper management. They had a different metric for success. It was all about the quarterly numbers, the immediate profit. I kept seeing these policies come down from on high that were designed to squeeze every last dollar out of our clients, even if it meant putting their long-term health at risk, upselling them on services they didn't need, locking them into restrictive long-term contracts, burying unfavorable terms in the fine print. It was a short-term game, and I wanted no part of it. So I became the obstacle. I was the one who would read a new sales initiative and immediately send back a 5-point email detailing how it would harm our key accounts. I was the one sitting in meetings arguing with the VPs, telling them that bleeding a client dry for a one-time bonus was a catastrophic strategy. I'd say this might look good on the spreadsheet this quarter, but next quarter that client will be gone, and so will their entire network. They'd just smile these tight, patient smiles and tell me I needed to be more of a team player. I gained a reputation in the hallways. I was difficult, I was obstinate. But on the phone with my clients, I was something else entirely. I was their lifeline. They knew that if I was their account manager, they were getting the unvarnished truth. I wouldn't just sell them something, I'd tell them if it was a bad fit. That trust, it was everything. My client retention rate was the highest in the company. They stayed with me through price hikes and competitors' offers because they knew I had their back. The irony was so thick you could taste it. The very thing that made me so valuable to the company's actual stability was the same thing that made me a pariah within its walls. The breaking point came with the Ethelred manufacturing account. They were a family-owned business, a cornerstone client for us for over a decade. They'd grown with us. The new CEO, a young guy from corporate, decided to implement a service tier restructuring. It was a fancy name for a brutal policy. It effectively forced our longest-standing clients onto a new, more expensive plan, while stripping away core features they'd relied on for years. They'd have to pay a premium just to get back the service they already had. It was a blatant cash grab, targeting the clients who were too entrenched to leave easily. I didn't say yes immediately. I let the silence hang on the line for a moment. I told him I'd need to think about it. I called him back the next day. I said I was open to the idea, but not under the old terms. We scheduled a meeting. This time, I wasn't in the cold conference room with HR. I was in the executive suite with David and the divisional VP. When the memo landed on my desk, I felt physically ill. I went straight to my director, Sarah. I laid it out for her. I said, Sarah, if we do this to Ethelred, we will lose them. This isn't just a price increase, this is a betrayal. They've been loyal to us. She sighed, that familiar weary sigh. Your job isn't to question strategy, she said. Your job is to communicate it effectively, frame it as an upgrade. I couldn't believe it. Frame a demotion as an upgrade. I refused. I told her I would not be the one to deliver that message. I said I would advise Ethelred to contest it, to push back. The meeting that followed was the final one. It was me, Sarah, and the head of sales, Mark. He was all smiles and slicked back hair. He started talking about shareholder value and aggressive growth targets. I listened for about 5 minutes before I interrupted him. I said, Mark, there is no long-term value in alienating the very clients who built this company. This policy is predatory. It's unethical. The room went silent. The word unethical hung in the air like a poison cloud. You just don't say that in a boardroom. 2 days later, I was called into HR. Sarah was there, but she wouldn't look me in the eye. The HR manager slid a folder across the table. My termination was effective immediately. The reason listed was insubordination and a persistent failure to align with company objectives. They told me I wasn't a team player, that I consistently prioritized client interests over the company's, as if they were two different things. They had a security guard escort me to my desk. To clean it out, it was the most humiliating walk of my life. The hardest part was the phone calls. I had a list of my clients, my people. I couldn't just disappear. I had to call them. Each one was like a small funeral. I'd say, this is my last day. I've been let go. The reactions were always the same. First, disbelief. Then anger. What do you mean? You're the only reason we're with this company. I had to be careful with my words. I couldn't badmouth the company, but I couldn't lie either. I'd just say my approach to client advocacy was no longer compatible with the company's new direction. They were smart people, they read between the lines. I could feel their loyalty shifting not away from me, but away from the company I had just left. The silence after I was gone was deafening. For the first few weeks, I tried to move on. I started looking for a new job, but then the emails started trickling in. Former colleagues, people I still trusted, sending me news from the inside. It started with Ethelred. They got the new contract from my replacement, took one look at it, and invoked their clause to terminate for cause, citing a fundamental breach of their agreement. They were gone within the month. Then it was like a dam broke. It wasn't just my client's word had spread through the industry. Other account managers' clients who had heard about what happened to me started asking uncomfortable questions. They looked at their own contracts with a more critical eye, and they started leaving one by one at first. And then in waves, the company's most stable, lucrative accounts were walking out the door. The very clients the new policy was designed to milk were revolting. I laid out my terms clearly. The consulting fee would be triple my previous hourly rate. My title would be Senior Client Strategy Advisor, reporting directly to the VP. And most importantly, I would have a permanent seat on the Technology Implementation Committee. Any future decisions regarding client-facing automation would require my sign-off. I wasn't angry or confrontational. I was strategic. I presented it as the only logical solution. They needed my specific, irreplaceable human capital. The revenue loss was staggering. It made the headlines in the business journals. Stalwart company faces client exodus. The articles all pointed to the controversial new service tier as the catalyst. The board of directors, who had been happy to ignore the complaints as long as the stock price was rising, suddenly had to pay attention. An internal investigation was launched. And of course, it found exactly what I had been shouting about for months. The policy was deemed detrimental to long-term client relationships and ultimately to the company's financial health. It was a complete vindication, but it felt hollow. The company I had loved was crumbling. Then I got the call. It was the chairman of the board himself. He asked to meet me for coffee. He was an older gentleman, someone who had been with the company during its founding years. He looked tired. He didn't mince words. He said, "We made a terrible mistake. We lost sight of what made us great. And in the process, we lost you." He told me about the financial freefall, the plummeting stock price, the toxic atmosphere in the office. Then he made an offer. He asked me to come back, not to my old job. He offered me the newly created position of Chief Client Officer, with a seat on the executive board. My mandate would be simple but monumental: to overhaul the entire company culture, to tear down the predatory policies, and rebuild everything around a single idea: genuine client advocacy. I sat there stirring my coffee, listening to him. I thought about all the stress, the humiliation, the feeling of being cast out for doing the right thing. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell. But then I thought about my clients, the ones who had followed me out the door. The principle wasn't just about me being right. It was about making the company right. This was a chance to fix it from the top, to build something that would last. I looked at him and said, "I'll come back on one condition. Client advocacy isn't just a department, it becomes the company's core value. It's written into every employee's contract. It's the first item on every board meeting agenda. We measure success not by quarterly profits, but by client success. If you agree to that, I am in." He didn't hesitate. He extended his hand, and we shook on it. Walking back into that building on my first day was surreal. The same hallways, the same lobby, but everything felt different. There was a nervous energy. People didn't know whether to avoid me or congratulate me. My first act was to dismantle the entire service tier restructuring. My second was to personally call every client who had left. I invited them back, not with a sales pitch, but with an apology and a new contract that reflected the partnership we should have had all along. Many of them came back, not all, but enough. We started from scratch. We rebuilt the entire sales and service model around transparency and long-term value. It was a slow, hard process. There was resistance, of course. Some of the old guard couldn't adapt and left. But slowly, the culture shifted. The company's reputation began to heal. We started winning back trust, one honest conversation at a time. Salvage the client relationships they had jeopardized. My value was no longer just my knowledge, it was my scarcity. They were backed into a corner, and they knew it. They agreed to everything. Now when I walk through the office I hear a different kind of conversation. Account managers are empowered to challenge policies that hurt clients. They're rewarded for retention, not just for new sales. The company is healthier and more profitable than it ever was during the aggressive growth days. Because the profit is built on a foundation of real sustainable relationships, they fired me for being too loyal to my clients. And in the end, that loyalty and the principle behind it became the very thing that saved them. Client communications, data analysis, and strategic recommendations, it would work 24/7, without needing sleep vacations or benefits. The logic, she said, was irrefutable. The cost savings were significant. It was a necessary step for the company's future. My return to the office was different. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was an asset. The same colleagues who had avoided me before were now quietly grateful. My first task was to personally call the heads of the 5 revolting clients. Each conversation was the same. I apologized for the frustration. I acknowledged the value of their long-term partnership. I assured them that a human touch was being restored. I didn't badmouth the AI. I simply repositioned it as a support tool, not a replacement. The relief in their voices was palpable. Trust was being rebuilt one conversation at a time. The AI system is still there, it's still running. But now it has a very specific limited role. It handles data aggregation. It sends out routine scheduling emails. It flags potential anomalies in reports for human review. It's a tool, a very powerful one. But it's in its proper place. I work with it. Now I use its data analysis. But I apply the context. I understand that a drop in sales for one client might be due to a regional economic downturn, while for another it might be a sign. Flawed product launch. The AI can't tell the difference. It just sees a number going down. The lesson was learned, and it was expensive for the company. Automation has its place. It's brilliant for efficiency, for scale, for handling repetitive high-volume tasks. But trust, nuance, empathy, and the ability to navigate the unspoken complexities of human relationships that cannot be programmed. It's an organic, cultivated thing. The clients weren't just paying for a service. They were paying for a relationship. They were paying for the assurance that someone understood their business, not just as a set of data points, but as a living, breathing entity with a history and a personality. They needed a partner, not a protocol. And in the end, no amount of code could replicate that. My value was no longer in the information I held, but in the understanding. I possessed the understanding that sometimes the most important data point is the one that was never written down. The first time I met her, she was a bundle of nervous energy, all sharp edges and big ideas, but no sense of how to actually land them. I saw something in her, a flicker of raw talent that just needed shaping. So I took her under my wing. I showed her everything, not just the how, but the why. I explained why you never lead with the price tag with the Henderson account, because old man Henderson values trust above everything. I shared my notes on the Delaney family, how the youngest daughter actually holds the most sway, not the father who signs the checks. These weren't just strategies, they were relationships built over a decade, built on late nights and kept promises. I gave her the keys to my entire kingdom. And she was a quick study, incredibly quick. At first it was flattering. Shed, absorb every lesson, every nuance. Her gratitude felt genuine. Shed, say things like, "It'd be lost without your guidance." And I believed her. I started giving her more responsibility, letting her lead client calls, with me just observing. I'd watch her charm them, using the very phrases, the very cadence I'd taught her. It was like looking at a reflection of my younger self. The reflection started to warp. I remember the quarterly review, after we landed the massive Bryson contract. It was my strategy, my years of nurturing that relationship that closed the deal. Shed, been in the room. Shed played her part well. But it was my playbook. In the meeting when the director praised the win, she just smiled and said thank you. The team worked incredibly hard. She didn't correct him when he assumed it was her lead. She just let the credit settle on her shoulders. That was the first reel. She slid a packet of papers across the table. It outlined a generous by their standard severance package. But there was a condition. They needed me to stay on for a 4-week transition period. My primary duty would be to train the AI. I had to upload my entire workflow, my contact list, my communication templates, my entire decade of institutional knowledge into this machine. It was the most surreal feeling sitting there listening to this woman calmly explain how I was to methodically dismantle my own chill. The gratitude in her eyes was replaced by something else, a calculating gleam. Then came the Sterling project. It was complex, with a lot of moving parts. I put her in charge of the initial data analysis. A crucial but manageable piece. I was focused on the final presentation, the big picture a week before the deadline. She came to me, her face a mask of concern. She said there were inconsistencies in the foundational numbers id. Provided that the whole financial model might be off, she presented it as a problem shed, uncovered a potential disaster. She was helping me avert. I was blindsided. Id built that model myself. It was solid. But she spoke with such conviction, pointing to convoluted spreadsheets, that I started to doubt my own work. I spent the next 48 hours tearing it apart, trying to find her supposed errors, which only put me behind on everything else. The day of the client presentation was a disaster. I was exhausted, scrambling to rework material that had been fine to begin with. My delivery was off. I stumbled over points I normally owned. And she was flawless. She stepped in with slick, polished slides that addressed the issues shed raised, positioning herself as the savior of the project. I sat there and watched her seamlessly present solutions to problems she herself had invented. The client was impressed with her foresight. My partners exchanged looks. The trap had been sprung, and I was right in the middle of it. The call from HR came 2 days later. They used words like restructuring and streamlining operations. They talked about a new direction that required fresh leadership. They said my position was being eliminated. It was all corporate nonsense, but the subtext was clear. Id been deemed redundant, obsolete. When I went to clear my desk, it was already happening. My things were in a cardboard box. And she was there, standing where I used to stand, already talking on my phone, using my old chair. She saw me. And she didn't even have the decency to look away. She gave me a small, tight smile, a look of pity mixed with triumph. It wasn't a smile of someone who'd won fair and square. It was the smile of a conqueror surveying captured territory. I picked up that box, feeling the weight of 15 years, reduced to cardboard and dreed-out pens, and I walked out without looking back. The silence afterward was deafening. For the first week, I just felt numb. Then the calls started. It was Margaret from the Henderson account. First, her voice was laced with confusion. "We just had our quarterly review with what's her name, your replacement," she said. It was all push, push, push. She tried to upsell us on 3 services. "We don't need." I kept waiting for her to ask about my grandson's graduation, like you always do. She never did. Then it was Robert from Delaney Industries. He was more direct. "What the hell is going on over there?" This new woman came in talking about aggressive growth targets and renegotiating terms. She treated a 20-year relationship like a cold call. I ended the meeting early. With every call, a small, bitter part of me felt vindicated, but a larger part just felt a profound sadness. These weren't just clients, they were people Id grown to respect, and she was treating them like entries on a spreadsheet. She was implementing all the textbook tactics Id warned her about: the aggressive closures, the feature redumping, the complete disregard for the human connection that actually sustains a business. She was so eager to prove she could outperform me that she forgot what the job was. Positioned to pour my expertise into a digital vessel that was designed to make me obsolete. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Of course, I couldn't talk about why I was leaving. The official story would be a restructuring. Actually about. The whispers grew louder. I'd meet an old contact for coffee, and they'd tell me they'd heard things: that the Bryson account was unhappy, that the Sterling project, the one shed used to oust me, was floundering, because the client felt misled. People were comparing notes. They were realizing that the ease they felt with me, the sense of partnership, wasn't a standard feature. It was the product of care. It was unique, and it was gone. The phone call from David, the senior partner, came about 3 months later. He asked me to come in for a chat. His voice was heavy when I walked into his office. The view was the same, but the man behind the desk looked older. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We made a mistake," he said, the words seeming to cost him something: a catastrophic error in judgment. He told me the fallout had been worse than anyone imagined. Client retention was plummeting, morale was in the gutter, the fresh direction had driven the company into a ditch. He looked me in the eye and said, "We need you back. The board is unanimous." He laid out the offer: a significant promotion, a seat on the partnership track. I'd been promised years ago complete autonomy over my division. And then he got to the part about her. "We've reassigned your former protégé," he said carefully. "Shall be focusing on new business development away from the existing client base." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang in the room. I thought about the betrayal, the humiliation of carrying that box out of the building. I thought about the clients who'd had my back without me even asking. I thought about my own worth, which had never been defined by that title or that desk. And I realized this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. I laid out my terms. I wanted a formal apology to the client's shed, alienated with my name on it. I wanted my team back, the people who'd been loyal to me and who'd been sidelined. And I wanted it written into my contract that I had final say on any strategic decisions regarding my accounts, no more interference from ambitious juniors. David agreed to everything. Walking back into the office that first morning was surreal. The air was different, thick, with a mixture of shame and relief. People didn't know whether to look me in the eye or avoid my gaze. My old desk was empty, waiting for me. As I sat down, I saw her across the floor, being shown a new, smaller cubicle, far from the executive suites. She was trying to look busy, but her shoulders were slumped. There was no triumphant smile now, just the deflated posture of someone who'd been found out. The victory wasn't sweet. It was quiet, it was sobering. The clients were relieved, their trust reaffirmed. My colleagues were respectful, maybe a little in awe of the whole saga. But the relationship I had with the job was forever changed. The blind trust was gone, replaced by a clear-eyed understanding of my own value. I wasn't just back in my chair. I was back on my own terms. The whole experience carved out a new space inside me, a harder, wiser core. The protégé had taken the job, but she could never take the respect I'd earned that was mine alone. And in the end, that was the only thing that really mattered. Those final weeks were strange. I'd come into the office, and my colleagues would avoid eye contact. Everyone knew, but no one could talk about it. I spent my days in a small windowless room with a tech team feeding data into the system. I had to explain the nuances, why we approached client A differently than client B, why a certain phrase, while technically correct, could come across as cold to a long-term partner. The AI would process it, its response always a variation of pattern recognized. It felt like teaching My desk was in the corner, the one with the flickering overhead light. Nobody ever got around to fixing it. Was fine by me. I liked the quiet. For 15 years I'd been the one who knew where the bodies were buried. So to speak, not in a sinister way. Just I knew things. I was the institutional memory. When a client called, I didn't need to pull up a file immediately. I could usually remember the name of their previous account manager, the specific complaint they had 5 years ago that led to the current contract clause, the quirky way their legacy software interacted with our newer platform. I knew which server would get temperamental when the weather turned humid, and which database query would slow to a crawl if you ran it after 3 p.m. on a Friday. It wasn't in any manual, it was just knowledge, the kind you accumulate by being there day in day out, paying attention when no one else was. The new management team, they were different. They were all about optics, big flashy presentations, with charts that showed growth trajectories. Shooting for the moon. They loved talk of synergies and disruptive innovation. My kind of work. The quiet, steady maintenance of things was invisible to them. It wasn't a metric on their dashboard. In a meeting once, I tried to explain the fragility of the payment processing system, how it was held together by a series of workarounds I'd coded over a decade. The new VP cut me off. He said my approach was tactical. When they needed to be strategic, he used words like legacy, drag, and technical debt. But he didn't understand that this so-called debt was actually the scaffolding keeping the whole operation upright. During my performance review, my manager said I wasn't a visible champion for the brand. My consistent reliability was recast as a lack of ambition. And then came the restructuring. I was deemed redundant, a cost-saving measure. The official email said the company was moving in a more dynamic direction, and my role was no longer aligned with their future vision. They gave me a severance package and escorted me out the same afternoon. I think the most telling part was that the IT guy who came to deactivate my keycard didn't even know my name. The first few weeks after I left, I heard through the grapevine that everything seemed fine. Of course it did. Systems have momentum. The processes I'd set up, the automated reports, the scheduled maintenance kept running on their own for a little while. It was like a watch that keeps ticking for a day. After the mainspring has broken, the new team, a group of bright, eager people who were great at PowerPoint, assumed this was the normal state of affairs. They were congratulating themselves on a seamless transition. Then came the first major crisis. It was with one of our oldest clients, Ethelred Industries. Their account was a labyrinth of customizations and special provisions. A history of compromises and unique solutions layered over 15 years. Their system went down a complete failure during a critical product launch. The new team dove and they followed the standard troubleshooting protocols, the ones documented in the official manuals. But the manuals didn't cover the Ethelred exception. They didn't mention that the root of their recurring issue was a specific conflict with an older Java version. They refused to update a conflict I patched every 6 months with a script I ran manually. The new team tried to apply a standard fix, and it made everything worse. It corrupted the data transfer. They spent 2 days going in circles. While Ethelred's CEO was screaming on the phone, the problem wasn't just technical, it was historical. They lacked the context. They didn't know that the former Ethelred point of contact, a man named Frank, had a handshake agreement with my old boss about response times, an agreement never written down, but honored for a decade. Without that context, every interaction became a friction point. That was the first domino. Ethelred's very public failure shook the confidence of other long-term clients. They started calling with nervous questions. And when they did, they found the new team didn't know their history. A client would ask about the annual pricing review from the Henderson merger, and the new account manager would have no idea what they were talking about, because that review was a gentleman's agreement, not a formal contract. Clause one by one, these small interconnected vulnerabilities I had managed. Very fast, very literal-minded student who was about to take your job. The discomfort was a constant, low hum in the background of every day. For years began to surface. The quarterly financial reconciliation hit a snag, because a key data pipeline, one I manually verified every quarter, failed silently. The new team didn't know to check it. The marketing automation platform started sending duplicate emails to a segment of high-value customers, because the API connection, which I had tweaked to handle a peculiar rate limit, was reset to its default unstable settings. It was a slow-motion collapse. Each failure seemed isolated at first, but I knew they were all threads from the same tapestry, the tapestry I had been weaving silently from my corner desk. About 2 months after I was gone, the situation became critical. The dominoes weren't just falling, they were creating a cascade. Client complaints were no longer trickling and they were flooding the support lines. Several major accounts sent formal notices of breach of contract. The CEO, who had initially signed off on the restructuring, started getting emails directly from clients. He played golf with they weren't angry emails, which would have been bad enough. They were disappointed emails that said, "We don't recognize your company anymore. The trust is gone." That's when management launched a desperate investigation. They brought in external auditors to figure out why a seemingly profitable and stable company was falling apart so quickly. The audit revealed the truth. It showed that a significant portion of the company's critical operational knowledge was not documented anywhere in their official systems. It existed in a series of personal notebooks, custom scripts on a decommissioned user account, and in the head of one person, me. The auditor's report was brutal. It stated that the company had eliminated its own institutional memory, and that my quiet work had in fact been mission-critical infrastructure. I was, in their words, a single point of failure that they had willingly created. The new VP, who had called my work tactical, was let go. The realization finally dawned on them that true expertise isn't always loud. It doesn't always present well in a boardroom, but its absence creates a vacuum that nothing else can fill. I was gardening when the call came. It was the CEO himself. His voice was strained. He offered a sincere apology. He admitted they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He said the company was on the verge of collapse, and pleaded with me to return. He offered me my old job back with a significant raise and a new title. I listened to it. All the desperation was palpable, but I had spent my time away thinking. I wasn't just angry or vindicated, I was resolved. I told him I would consider returning, but not on the old terms. My condition was that I would not simply be a fixer. I said I would come back to lead a restoration project, but it had to be done properly. I insisted on a formal company-wide initiative to document every process, every legacy system quirk, every piece of tribal knowledge. I demanded a budget for a proper mentorship program, where I would train a small team not just on the how, but on the why. The why was the part they never understood. The why is the history, the context, the reason the workaround was necessary in the first place. I made it clear that my goal was to make my own specific knowledge redundant, but in the right way, be distributing it by embedding it into the company's fabric, not by deleting it. After a long pause, he agreed to every condition. I went back, but it was different. My corner desk was gone. I had an office now, but I rarely used it. I was mostly on the floor with the new team, walking them through the intricate clockwork of the business. We created a living knowledge base. We documented the Ethelred patch. We wrote down the story of the Henderson merger handshake deal. We mapped the fragile data pipeline. It was arduous work. But it was honest. The moral of the story wasn't just that they shouldn't have fired the quiet guy, it was that they. The first reports started to trickle in about a month after my departure. I heard about it from a former coworker, Mark, who stayed in touch. It was small stuff at first. The AI had sent a standard happy holidays email to a client who had just experienced a bereavement. It had misread sarcasm in a client's email as a serious statement of intent, leading to a minor contractual confusion. It had recommended a completely standard marketing approach to a client who was explicitly trying. Had failed to see that true deep expertise is often silent. It doesn't need to announce itself, it just works reliably in the background, holding everything together. But when it's gone, the silence it leaves behind isn't peaceful. It's the deafening silence of a machine, grinding to a halt. It's the sound of a structure, realizing too late what its foundation really was. My vision for the Aurora campaign was complete. It was more than just a marketing plan. It was a story. We would use these stark, beautiful black and white photographs of everyday people at dawn. Just as the first light hit their faces, the tagline was simple: see your true potential. It was bold, a little raw, and it relied entirely on emotional resonance. Rather than a cheesy sales pitch, I presented it to the senior partners. With everything I had, I showed them the mood boards, the photographer's portfolio, the focus group data that showed a powerful connection with the target demographic. The room was silent for a moment too long. Then Robert, the managing partner, cleared his throat. He said it was certainly interesting, but it was also a huge departure from their usual style. He called it a significant risk. He wanted something brighter, more colorful, something that felt safer. He suggested we use stock photos of diverse groups of people laughing with the Aurora logo superimposed in the corner. He said it was a proven formula. He said clients respond to positivity. I argued that positivity without authenticity is just noise, that this client Aurora was trying to break into a crowded market. They needed to stand out, not blend in. I told him safe is the riskiest choice you can make right now. The other partners shifted in their chairs. They avoided looking at me. Robert's smile was thin, polite. He said the board had concerns. He said my approach, while passionate, was creating a divisive atmosphere. He said I needed to learn that business is a collaborative effort, not personal art project. He gave me a week to rework the campaign into something more aligned with the company's traditional values. The ultimatum was clear: conform or be considered insubordinate. I spent that week trying to find a compromise, but every time I tried to incorporate their suggestions, the campaign lost its soul. It became a Frankenstein's monster of half-measures. The stark photography was replaced with generic office scenes. The powerful tagline was watered down to Aurora, a brighter tomorrow. It felt empty. I couldn't do it. I went back to the meeting and told them I believed in the original vision too strongly to dismantle it. I said, if this wasn't the direction for the company, then perhaps I wasn't the right fit for this leadership role. Robert didn't seem surprised. He said he was disappointed. He said the firm needed team players. He accepted my resignation from the lead creative director position. It was framed as a mutual agreement, a strategic pivot, but we both knew it was a firing. They hired Martin 2 days later. He came from one of our biggest competitors, and his reputation preceded him. He was known as a safe pair of hands in our industry. That's code for someone who never rocks the boat. I was kept on as a senior consultant, relegated to smaller, less important accounts. I had to sit in the same meetings at the same table. While Martin took over the Aurora campaign, he was always perfectly dressed, always agreeing. If Robert said the sky was green, Martin would nod. To break into a new, edgier demographic, the errors were dismissed by management as teething problems. The system was still learning, they said. Clients just needed to adjust to the new, more efficient way of working. And talk about the specific shade of green. I watched as he systematically took my vision apart. He presented his version to the team. It was exactly what Robert had asked for: bright, colorful, full of smiling people who looked like they'd never had a difficult thought in their lives. The new tagline was Aurora makes your day. It was meaningless. The entire campaign was focus grouped to death, stripped of any edge or personality. It was the blandest, most corporate thing I had ever seen, and the partners loved it. They praised Martin for his pragmatism, his business acumen. I had to sit there and listen to them applaud the evisceration of my work. It was like watching someone paint over a masterpiece with beige house paint. The day they presented the new campaign to the Aurora client was the quietest day in the office. Everyone was waiting a few hours. After the presentation started, I saw Robert and Martin walk back to the conference room. Their shoulders were slumped. Martin's face was pale. They closed the door, but you could feel the tension radiating through the glass walls. Later, I heard the details from a junior account manager who was in the room. The client's head of marketing, a woman named Sarah Jensen, had listened politely to Martin's presentation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is this a joke?" She said they had chosen our firm over several others specifically because of my initial pitch. She said they were captivated by the boldness, the authenticity. She called Martin's campaign profoundly generic and said it was exactly the kind of forgettable advertising they were trying to avoid. She pointed out that their brand name Aurora means dawn. She said my concept of capturing the first light was not just creative, it was strategically brilliant. She said this new campaign completely missed the point. She asked where I was when they explained that I had been moved to other projects. She was furious. She said they signed a contract based on a creative promise that was now being broken. She threatened to pull the entire account, a multi-million-dollar contract, if the original vision was not reinstated immediately. The panic in the office was palpable. Robert called an emergency board meeting that lasted well into the evening. I just kept working on my smaller projects, trying to ignore the whispers and the frantic glances thrown my way. The call came to my personal phone that night. It was Robert. His voice was different. All the bluster was gone. He sounded tired, humbled. He said they had misjudged the situation. He admitted that in their pursuit of a safe bet, they had lost sight of what made our work valuable. He said the client's reaction was a wake-up call. He said, and I remember his exact words, "It turns out our clients hire us for your vision, not for our compliance." He asked me to come back, not just to lead the Aurora campaign, but to take on a new role as head of creative vision, with a seat on the leadership board. He said they needed my perspective at the highest level to prevent this from happening again. Then the bigger issue happened. It was with our largest account, Peterson Global. The AI was managing the quarterly review process. It analyzed their sales data, and based on its programming, identified what it called an underperforming product line. Its recommendation was to immediately discontinue it and reallocate resources. It was a logical conclusion from a pure data perspective. What the AI didn't know, what it couldn't possibly have understood, was the context. That product line was the first. I didn't say yes immediately. I told him I needed to know that this was a real change, that it wasn't just a temporary fix to pacify an angry client. I asked him if he was truly ready to embrace the kind of work that involves real risk. He paused. And then he said the greater risk is producing work that nobody remembers. That was all I needed to hear. Walking back into the office, the next Monday was a strange experience. The energy was different. People looked at me with a new kind of respect. Martin was gone. His position had been eliminated. My first meeting was with the Aurora team. I stood up and presented the original campaign, exactly as I had first envisioned it. There were no objections, no suggestions. To make it safer, the team was energized, excited to be working on something that felt meaningful again. We shot the campaign. The photographs were even more powerful than I had imagined. When we presented the final work to Sarah Jensen and her team, the reaction was the complete opposite of before. She was thrilled. She said it was everything she had hoped for, and more. She signed a 2-year extension on the spot. The triumph wasn't just about winning back the account, it was about the quiet shift that happened within the company. After that, other creatives started bringing bolder ideas to the table. The leadership team started asking, is it compelling, instead of is it safe? My seat at the board table meant I could advocate for creative integrity from the inside. It wasn't always easy. There were still debates and disagreements. But now they were about how to best serve the idea, not how to dilute it. That experience taught everyone a brutal but necessary lesson. Conformity might feel secure, but it has no value. Clients, like everyone else, are hungry for something real, something that speaks to them on a human level. They can smell authenticity from a mile away, and they can just as easily smell the lack of it by trying to replace a vision with a formula management, almost sank the entire ship. It was the client's demand for that original authentic voice that forced a reckoning in the end, artistic. Integrity, when it's backed by a real strategic understanding, isn't a liability, it's the most valuable asset a creative company has, and no amount of yes men can ever replicate its power. The breaking point didn't feel dramatic. It wasn't a single moment where I threw my hands up and screamed. It was quieter than that. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was staring at my computer screen. The words on the email I was supposed to be writing had started to blur together. My head was throbbing with a dull, constant pressure. I realized I'd been reading the same sentence for 5 minutes. My performance had been declining for months. I knew it. My manager knew it. I was missing small details. Forgetting follow-ups, things I never used to forget. My mental health was just gone. I felt hollowed out. The workload wasn't just unsustainable. It was consuming everything. I had no energy left for my family, for friends, for myself. I'd lie awake at night, with my heart racing just thinking about the inbox waiting for me in the morning. So I finally scheduled the meeting. I sat down with my manager and the department head. I laid it all out. I wasn't asking for a promotion or a raise. I was asking for a break, a temporary leave of absence. Just a few weeks to try and recover, or, if that wasn't possible, a reduced schedule, 4 days a week, instead of 5, anything to create a little space to breathe. I presented it logically. I showed them the metrics, the project load, the overtime I'd been logging for years. I thought they would see it. I thought they would understand that this was an investment in keeping a valuable employee. But their response was cold. They didn't see a cry for help. They saw a liability. They viewed my request as a sign of weakness, a lack of commitment. The department head actually said, "We need people who are Alan here. This is a fast-paced environment. Maybe it's just not the right fit for you anymore." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. After a decade of loyalty, of missing school plays and family dinners to hit deadlines,